Today what we're going to talk about are some of the research issues that are highlighted in your book. Dr. McCoy did a really nice job talking about some of the problems or some of the issues that you have to consider when you're doing research on child maltreatment. But I want to go over it in a lecture as well, because I found that students often have a difficult time with that first paper being critical of the research. So I thought that we might want to go over it in addition to having it in the book. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about is some things that are important or relevant, particularly for this type of research. So we're not going to be talking about some of the research issues that you see in other kinds of research areas, but actually issues that are important in child maltreatment research. One of the first issues is that in many research studies, only identified children are studied. And what do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. Let's say you want to study neglect, and you go to the Department of Family Services, and sure enough, they're going to let you have a sample of children, and you're going to find a control group, and you're going to compare the neglected to the non-neglected group and see how they differ. And of course, you want to attribute that difference to the neglect itself. But how might children who have been turned into Department of Family Services and their cases substantiated, how might they be different from children who haven't been identified but are still suffering from neglect? For example, you might find that when you have only children who have identified, you might find that the people who are likely to get turned into the Department of Family Services, maybe they're the children of poorer parents, parents with less means. Those are the kids that are likely to be turned in. If that was the case, then any of the differences that you find between the neglect and the control group might be attributable to poverty rather than the neglect itself. So you're always going to run that risk when you have identified children. One solution to this problem is to do what we call a retrospective study. What you do here is you get a sample of adults and then ask them about the neglect that they were exposed to as children. Now think about that. That's one way to get around the only identified, because some of those adults suffered from neglect, but it was never turned into the Department of Family Services. But these kinds of studies also have limitations. What are those limitations? Obviously, one big limitation has to do with memory. Depending on what age the people are when they're being asked, they may not remember their childhood in the same way that they did years before. Also, in a retrospective study, you have to rely on people's willingness to report what happened to them. So they may have experienced some pretty bad things, but they don't want to report that those things happened to them. And also, you'll have the risk also of people falsely reporting that they were neglected. I mean, that's probably not very common, but certainly that's a possibility as well. So, who is being studied is the first important thing to consider. Another important thing to consider is that it's difficult to separate different forms of maltreatment. I just told you that suppose we wanted to do a study on neglect. Well, the fact of the matter is that many neglected kids also have suffered from other types of maltreatment. And so what we may have then is I have a group of kids that I'm trying to look at neglect, but I'm really actually looking at, let's say, psychological abuse, because all of the kids have also suffered from psychological abuse. Now, the issue of separating different forms of maltreatment is something that you need to just look at and report it if they're not able to do that. For example, sometimes when you do a study, you may not have access to all of the different kinds of maltreatment that a child has experienced. So for example, my DFS example, DFS may have children in the system and they have categorized them as neglect. That's what the cases were substantiated for. And they don't go any further to find out whether or not the child's also been psychologically abused, and so forth and so on. So I may not be able to separate the different forms of maltreatment. I may just have to say, this kid has suffered from maltreatment. I'm not quite sure. I may know that they have suffered from multiple types of maltreatment. And I may want to delete that child from the study if I want to purely study neglect. Or I may code for it in some way and kind of control for it statistically. For creative ways in which people have tried to separate different forms of maltreatment, read your Focus on Research on page 17 of your book. And you'll see some creative ways in which researchers have tried to separate different types. Next issue that's important is that the effects of maltreatment may not be immediately obvious. For example, we are going to find out that a lot of children who have experienced sexual abuse don't seem to be showing any obvious signs of any obvious problems. But what we will see is that as they get older, you might start to see some of the effects of that sexual abuse. So you have to be careful about the timing. If I'm looking at the long-term effects of sexual abuse, I want to go into mid-adulthood to be able to be sure that I'm seeing it or not seeing it. Now, one solution to this problem, of course, is to do longitudinal research, where you get a group of people who have experienced a certain kind of maltreatment and you follow them over time and look at how their issues evolve over time. Obviously, big problems with longitudinal research. It takes time and it takes money. And we always have to worry about attrition. Trying to keep track of people over a long period of time, you may lose certain parts of your population. So for example, you might lose the people who are of lower socioeconomic status because they tend to move more. And so you may lose your sample. So basically, you have to try to think about what you're trying to study and whether or not this is a good age group to choose. Another issue, and a big issue in maltreatment research, it's the difficulty of separating the effects of poverty with the maltreatment. Abuse, most of the abuse that we're going to be talking about is often confounded with poverty. So for example, if you wanted to do a study of school performance of maltreated children, and you basically find that they're significantly below, performing below whether it's grades, standardized tests, if you find that they're significantly below non-maltreated children, wouldn't you also expect the same result if you compared children who are poor to those who are not? So you have to be careful. So how would you correct? How would you deal with this kind of situation? Well, there's two ways that people try to deal with this, and that's what I want you to look for in your articles. One way is to get a comparison group, your non-maltreated children, and try to match them on socioeconomic status to the maltreated children. So you're making sure that if your maltreated children are poor, your non-maltreated children are poor. So that's one way. The other way is to control it statistically. And so you'll see this in some of the articles where they measured socioeconomic status, and they didn't have comparison groups. You'll see this especially in longitudinal studies. And so what they have to do is they try to control for it statistically by taking out the effects of poverty first and then looking at maltreatment. And that's one of the things that you're going to see. The next issue is an issue with virtually every single study of child maltreatment. The studies that you're likely to run into are correlational studies. Obviously, for obvious reasons. I mean, you cannot randomly assign children into a maltreatment condition. So virtually all of the maltreatment research is correlation. We can say some variables are related, but we can't say anything about causation. When you write your papers up, this is one of the issues that you should mention, because this is true of virtually every single study that has been published on maltreatment. The next issue is the lack of clear definitions. If we go back to the example I started with, and I went to DFS and I asked them, for a group of neglected children, I'm obviously going to be using the state statutes. So I will be talking about neglected kids as defined by Wyoming. And you're going to see that states differ quite a bit in some of their statutes. Some states, for example, if a parent is using drugs in front of a child, they put it into their neglect statute. In some states, they put it into the physical abuse statute. So if I'm using a group from Wyoming, I'm really kind of stuck with Wyoming's definition. There are some fancy research definitions out there, which are much better, but few people use them because it requires a lot of information that researchers often don't have. What you're going to see more likely is that the researchers will make up their own definition for the purposes of their study. So what they'll do is they'll say, this is how we defined physical abuse. This is how we defined neglect. And maybe they did a great job, something to think about. But certainly it's an issue because every researcher then is using their own idiosyncratic definition. And it makes you wonder whether we can draw conclusions across studies. Finally, the last issue with regarding maltreatment is secrecy. Many people do not want to admit maltreatment. Even victims of maltreatment will often be reticent to report that they were maltreated. So for example, there was this one study that was done with adult women where we had known cases of sexual abuse. So in other words, these were cases of sexual abuse in which it was substantiated, and maybe even the perpetrator was prosecuted. So you have a group of people that you know were sexually abused. They're adults now. And what they did was they called them up and asked, in a series of questions, asked them if they would be part of the study. And one of the questions in the study was, have you ever been sexually abused as a child before 18? And you'd be surprised at the number of women, and this is mostly women, who said no. Okay? So did they forget they were sexually abused? It's possible, because if it happened when they were young enough, they may not remember it. But I think the more likely answer is that people don't want to talk about it. And so if you're doing like a retrospective study, you may get people who just don't want to talk about it. Okay, so those are the big issues that you need to focus on in your articles. So let's go ahead and practice. Okay, what I'd like to do is we'll look at 3 articles, and I want to show you how you kind of navigate the articles to find out the information that we want. So here's article number 1. Okay, this is child neglect and maltreatment and childhood to adulthood cognition and mental health in a prospective birth cohort. Okay, whenever you see something like this, you're probably talking about a longitudinal study. One of the first places to go is right here in the abstract. And what I've done is I've gone ahead and looked through this article just to kind of highlight some of the places where you might look to find the answers to the questions. So this right here is the purpose of the study. And so this would be a nice sort of why did they do the study, what did they do kind of thing. Okay. Once you get through the abstract, and sometimes the abstract has some pretty important information, kind of look through it and see if you get any information that you need. As far as the actual article goes, I certainly encourage you all to read the articles, but really to answer the questions that we're doing for this paper, you don't really have to read the articles. What you do have to do is get to the method section. The method section is where you're going to find most of the information. So this sample right here, okay, this is where we're going to try to find out if only identified people are studied. Okay, so it says data is from this both birth cohort born at this specific time, recruited. Okay, the cohort's primarily white. Okay, that's helpful, but not terribly helpful at this point. Okay, because I don't know quite how they're identifying the kids. However, if I got the children from a Department of Family Services sample, I should be mentioning it right there. Okay, here's where it gets interesting. This is how child maltreatment was defined. So it says that neglect was identified from information collected prospectively in childhood and retrospectively in adulthood. So what they did in childhood was they obtained information from parents and the child's teacher and derived a neglect scale. So it's kind of identified children, but then as adults, they interviewed them at 45 years of age and asked them if they had been neglected. So they did both prospective and retrospective, okay, which is maybe a little bit better than that if they had only used self-report or just only had done the teacher ratings, okay? So here you go. Childhood abuse to 16 years of age was reported in adults 45 using a confidential direct computer entry questionnaire. So they did both a prospective and a retrospective, okay? Let's see. Oops. Okay, right here, confounding factors. What they're doing here is they're trying to statistically control for factors that might be important. And here, this using parental education is one way to measure socioeconomic status. So what they're trying to do is statistically control for social class. And let's see, is there anything else in here that I've highlighted? No. So let's go through some of the other issues here. Are you unable in this study to make a causal statement? Absolutely. This is a correlational study. What about the issue of whether or not the effects may not be immediately obvious? Well, these people are now 45 years old, and if the effects of their maltreatment aren't showing up now, it probably never will. So it looks like they have at least picked a sample where if something was going to happen, it certainly should happen by now. What about the issue of secrecy? Yes, this is definitely a problem because their abuse, part of their abuse is retrospective. And by the way, if I'm not mistaken, is this the one where they looked at both physical abuse? I don't think so. But anyway, there you go. We answered all the questions by going through the article. Shall we try another one? Article 2, okay? This one, child maltreatment and risk behaviors, the roles of callous, unemotional traits and conscientiousness. Okay, interesting. Right away, we go to the abstract. And here we get the answer to one of our questions. Young adults and parents completed questionnaires on child maltreatment histories. So we do not have the problem that only identified children are studied. These are young adults and they're asking about their childhood. This is a retrospective study, but of course, then it raises other issues. Okay, again, we can skip through the introduction and get to that. Aha. This here again, just to show you what they were trying to study. Okay. Okay, here we know again, undergraduate students. So we know that this is a retrospective study. Oops. Child maltreatment. Child maltreatment was assessed using this child abuse trauma scale, 38-item self-report questionnaire with empirically tested convergent validity against other measures of maltreatment. They measured 4 types: physical, sexual, verbal, and emotional abuse. Now, this is probably a good way to define your constructs. They're using a scale that has been validated and tested with other samples. So this is probably a pretty good way to measure maltreatment itself. And you'll notice that there are other things that this study is looking at, but we don't need to worry about that. Okay, let's look to see what their confounds and how they're going to deal with covariates. Here they said they used age, gender, and minority status as covariates. Is that really a good way to deal with social class and poverty? I mean, minority status helps a little bit because minority status is correlated with socioeconomic status. But that's not a very good way to do this. And in fact, in this study, one of the biggest problems with this study is they did not control for the effects of poverty. So it raises another issue. Can they make causal statements in this study? Absolutely not. Are the effects immediately obvious? You've got a college sample here. What do you think? I think it's a tough call. Sometimes you might say yes and you might say no. So you might at least address it. Secrecy, again, is an issue because we've got self-report. Okay, last article. This is mental health and behavioral outcomes of sexual and non-sexual child maltreatment among child welfare involved youth. Okay, so they are going to compare sexual abuse to other types of child maltreatment. Okay, here we go. The nationally representative National Survey of Child and Adolescent Well-Being. And what they've identified children who enter the child welfare system with substantiated sexual abuse and those who with exclusive non-sexual maltreatment. So yes, here we have a sample where only identified children are being used. But this is a longitudinal study. So we go through the intro again. Don't really need to know that. Okay. Basically, here it tells you what this study is about. Okay. Okay, this is a cohort, substantiated and unsubstantiated investigations. Okay. But the present study was restricted to only those that were substantiated. So again, same thing. Okay, sexual abuse. It seems like this would be pretty important to measure this. A dichotomous variable was generated from the variable for child maltreatment type in this data set. If the primary reason for substantiated maltreatment was sexual abuse, then this variable was coded as 1. And if the primary reason for the substantiated maltreatment was physical abuse and neglect or others, it was coded as 0. So, okay, what they're trying to do here is to try to say that what we're going to pay attention to, there may have been other maltreatment issues in the family, but we're going to take the primary reason for the substantiated abuse. Okay, and this may be good or not. You might want to mention it if you saw something like this and explain why you think it's good or why you don't think it's good. Let's see, is there anything else that we have here? Oh, control measures. There we go. They are controlling for SES and education. So to recap on this one, the secrecy issue is probably not an issue here because we've got identified cases that have been investigated and substantiated. Can you make causal statements? No, still can't make causal statements. Because they're controlling for SES, they're dealing with the poverty issue. Are the effects not immediately obvious? How old were the children or the people in this particular study? Let's see. You might want to take a look at that and see whether or not they're at the point where they might actually show some differences. Okay, so we've gone through a couple, pretty easy. You don't have to read the whole article. Just before we stop, I just want to show you how to go about finding your articles. Okay, here we are at the UW Libraries site, www.lib.uwyo.edu. Okay, now what you want to do is simply type in child maltreatment and do search. Okay, and what you want to do is look at how many results we have here. First of all, what you want to do is you want to get rid of the magazine articles. Okay, you want scholarly peer review articles is what you want. And here you go. These are the scholarly peer review articles. You don't want magazines, and you do want journal articles. Oops, I want this. Okay. And then you might refine your search. Let's just say you might want to do sexual abuse to refine your search a bit. And just poke around and find an article that you'd like to look at. It's as simple as that. So hopefully with this little bit of overview, you'll have no problem doing your research paper. Okay? Great. Take care and have fun looking for articles.